I'm going to show you the best exposure settings to use for real estate photography, and they're going to hinge on two important factors that we can see in this simple image. While block A does look darker, notice B and C, and notice there's a difference across B. And what we're seeing though is actually an illusion because all three of these blocks are actually identical. Once we remove the background gradient, then we can see that all three, A, B, and C, are exactly the same block, but when we put that gradient back in, then we're perceiving something that's different, and they look to have a different amount of brightness or luminance to it, and that is a core of exposure with these two things that are so crucial, and it's the difference between luminance or luminosity and also brightness. And we often think that they're really the same thing, but they're not. The big difference, and I'm going to show some settings, how you're going to apply those in your camera and also to various situations that you're going to come across in real estate photography. But understanding that luminance is what we're going to measure. That's something that if we were to completely remove that gradient, all three of those blocks look the same. So if you were to use a histogram or some type of light meter, you're going to be measuring luminance, and that's good. But that's just the mathematical reality of physics of what we're measuring. But so much relies on so many other factors when it comes to real estate photography and many other genres of photography as well. And that's where brightness comes in. So what we need to do is understand that brightness is relative to the amount of luminance that we're going to use. So by measuring our luminance, by measuring the exposure settings as we're changing them in our camera, we need to be aware of that brightness factor that's going to be affected and where the luminance in the image is going to affect that brightness. So let's dive into some examples so we can really take a deep dive into this to see the difference not just between luminance and brightness, but how we use this to our advantage when we're changing our exposure settings for real estate photography. So let's take this kitchen as our first example. This is kind of what you'd expect if you were exposing for real estate photography, and that we can see we've got the ETTR, that exposing to the right, or a histogram when we're measuring luminosity, or in this case we could also change it to colors. We're still going to see that peak at kind of that 3/4 mark, sometimes the 2/3 mark, and this would just be very typical of doing real estate photography. Now this is using flash. You could have done something similar with HDR. We're going to get a different result here using flash, but if we take a look at the base image, we can see that this, if we were exposing for this, well, it's going to be farther to the right because we have so many highlights up here from these lamps coming in through the windows. But that was fine because once I introduced flash into this by doing some of the then luminosity blending mode, then we've got something that is more evenly exposed. So we've got this then with the ambient luminance over top of it. And that's from taking our ambient shot like we have here. And as you've seen me do before many times when we're doing the flambient process, that's used up here in another layer that is in luminosity blending mode. Now if I had all the luminance turned on, then it would be very bright. But what I'm able to do in controlling the amount of luminosity, I can then have something that is definitely more controlled. So once I've got that done and I do all the post-processing, then I've got this image. And this works very well, once again, for most real estate photography where you've got a lot of bright features and we can expose to the right. That won't always be the case. But what this also meant then, to be able to use flash, was I needed to keep my ISO reasonable. I didn't want to use an ISO in my flash shots that was like at ISO 100. That's going to require too much flash. So my sweet spot, if you've probably seen in other videos, is right around ISO 320. I'm using f8 for this particular image. And then the shutter speed is at sync speed when I'm doing the flash shots like this one. That way I can cut out the ambient light. Now when I'm doing the ambient shot, of course that's different. Here in this case, this was only about 1/8 of a second. Once again, ISO 320 f8. But by adding these flash shots on top of it, then I cut out all that ambient luminance and then I add it back in where I need to selectively. So this allows me to control brightness and luminance, and in this case it is almost really identical. Now, I want to get on to the other examples here so you can see the difference where this won't work, but first I did want to mention that if you're not familiar with using the flambient process or some of the techniques that I'm talking about here, then I'd invite you to take a look at my courses on real estate photography. As you may know, I have courses that cover professional interior photography, expert editing, exterior photography. I also have courses on videography for real estate business and marketing, also for real estate photography. And I have books also on real estate photography, and links are down in the description of this video to all of that material. So once again though, this was a best case scenario of when we're going to expose to the right, and so it's not that hard to use the standard ISO 320, f8, and then we're using about sync speed for our flash shots, and then just exposing farther to the right though when we're doing our ambient shot, because we have to look at where the luminance is going to fall, and there was a lot of deep shadowed areas, and that's why there's some clipping going on here, but that clipping is going on from these lights. Anyways, definitely a typical example. Let's get to something that is not typical. So same property here for this image. Now this is the finished image. If we take a look at just the ambient shot, we can see that it's a very, very dark room. But in this case, I don't want to have so much luminance, so much brightness here to the bed that I'm going to blow it out. So when I'm doing the flash shots, you can see I did a typical two-sided composite here. That's just me editing the other side out, and a key light near the camera. I knew that I'm going to really be lighting up this room. So when it comes to the amount of ambient luminance that I want to place on here, I want to make sure that this is exposing for the most important feature, which is going to be this bed. And that's why after putting together my flash shot composite, then as I'm adding then the ambient luminance, instead of it being just 100%, you can see this layer is only 50%. If I were to have that at 100% luminance, and I cranked that all the way up and had no layer mask on this, then it's just going to be flash color corrected, but all ambient luminance, which we don't want. So instead, what we should do is, like I had before, typical 50-50 flambient, where I've got this set at 50% luminance, 50% opacity on that luminance layer, and then I'm editing some of that luminance out where I just don't want it to be. Now I can take that further like I did here and add some more selective flambient, which is another ambient layer, but just a little bit more luminance once again added in there. But the thing is, once we get down here and take a look at the finished product, take a look at the histogram, and this is important. At this point, I'm no longer exposing to the right. My goal for this image was to really get a mood to it, and even though I'm exposing to the left, which is shown here on this peak, it wasn't that I was trying to expose to the left. What I was trying to do was then get subjective brightness. And I can see that subjective brightness because the luminance is very high in some areas, and at least I'm getting rid of some of the shadows in the other areas that I really don't want. And by the way, this one didn't need a darken mode window pull because using flash, I was able to get plenty enough view to the outside. But then there are cases where we might go even darker. And for instance here. Now in a case like this, where you're trying to get an outside view at twilight, or let's say that you were shooting some type of indoor movie theaters, like a home theater that's going to be having a black ceiling, very dark features. In this case, you don't want to be exposing to the right. If you did, it would be way overexposed. The feel of this image is way over to the left, exposing really far to the left. But that's our luminance. That's our luminance. That is not our brightness, because the brightness relates to the subject. And the subject in this case is this view. So let's take a look at that really close. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to crop this image in to where I get just the subject here measured on the histogram. So if I were to take a look at just that view, then I can see on the histogram our measured luminance is high. That is a trick to looking at the whole image and then seeing, is the brightness fooling us, or do we have the proper luminance where we need to? So instead, before cropping, you can see we were very far to the left, but when we look at our subject, we can see that we're not. This is actually good. So this is where luminance and brightness really start to overlap. But now let's move on to a combination issue. So this was one done for an interior designer for this mid-century modern kitchen. It overlooks some of the coastal areas of Ventura out here. And you can see that there were a lot of layers to get this going, because this is a difficult image that's going to give us an example of a combination problem between luminance and brightness. Now, since this was done for a design, designer, yes, there was a lot of time spent on site and there was a lot of time spent editing because you get paid by the hour to do this type of stuff and make it right. But let's start at the bottom. Let's take a look at what it took to make this. So I'm shooting an ambient shot here and you can see it's just awful. And the ambient shot is really exposing to the right, but that's picking up all these highlights here on the right side. Over here, this was still really dark. Now, I know that I could take this and knock out some of those highlights if I needed to, but I'm going to be using flash, so it's real easy. I just start flashing, and of course I'm doing the typical two-sided composite here, going back and forth from side to side. There's a key light near the camera, just like I show in the courses. So here I've got this then evenly lit to where it's like I have reduced a lot of the highlights, but not all of them. I've got this area here that's too hot. I've got this area here that's too hot, but the key here, before moving forward to how I'm going to correct that, is that you don't necessarily want to try to capture in a single flash shot or even a composite all of the corrections of luminance and brightness. It's good to start with something here where, yes, most of it can now be corrected with ambient luminance, but there's other tricks involved with it. The next one involved is to darken this floor. You'll notice that's what this layer is here. This layer, notice, is in darken blending mode. And what that is it's me, it's hard to see here, but it's darkening that floor. If I turn this into normal mode so you can see what I was doing, here is where I dropped the ISO, dropped it down to ISO 100, and I'm flashing up here just to get this area of flooring. And then by turning that then into a darken blending mode and just blending some of that in there, I'm able to really reduce those highlights here on the floor. Then it's time for me, before worrying about the windows at all, that's time for me to add my ambient luminance, which I did here. So this is the basic ambient luminance. So this is where I've taken that ambient shot and I've turned this into luminosity blending mode at 50%. Once again, a typical 50-50 flambient like I teach in the courses. So I've got that and then selectively blended in, but you can see I erased it pretty much off the floor, but now I've got some pretty good light going here, but I can go further now. This is the general luminance that's been added to it, but I can add a little bit more luminance here. For instance, I did over this window. That's what this particular image was here. If I take a look at the layer mask, you can see I was just painting in a few areas right there. The next thing was just a few color corrections. These are real typical no matter what. And then comes the window pull. And that's where with this image, I'm shooting at the windows. I've got darken mode put on here for this layer, and I can just cut those windows in real easy. You've seen me do that probably 1,000 times, and you can see some of it's also on the floor. I don't have to cut in each window. I just take the entire area. It's going to go dark. A few other color corrections I saw, a couple repairs then for the window layer with a no flash shot. You've seen me once again do this for window pulls. And then a few other things to get like a window pull for this window over here. But most importantly was to control the brightness out here. And that was done with a brightness contrast layer where I lowered the brightness and then I just went ahead and cut it in over top of where the wood was here on this patio so we can just tone that down a little bit. Then I do the post-processing, and that's what this was here. Smart Object brought into Adobe Camera Raw, typical settings, bring down the highlights a little bit and whatnot, but then I took it a little further. Since this was for a designer, I removed all the power lines for them and a few other things. So this is real typical. These things I leave for the second round of edits because once again, you're getting paid by the hour. You just don't do it just free of charge. All this stuff does take time, so you charge by the hour to, for instance, remove that stuff. And then comes then a few other interesting things which are really related to luminance, and that's what I did with this last group here. So the sky was just a little still on the bright side. We're having a problem here controlling all kinds of luminance and brightness. With that sky being so bright, what I was able to do was take a curves layer, which I'll show you how I applied, but this other layer, which was stamped of the other ones, and then all I did was add a little bit of dehaze to it with Adobe Camera Raw. Then the curves. So I'm able to then take the curves layer and I lowered some of the highlights. So that's very typical. If I didn't do that, if I reset this curves layer, you can see, boom, then they're bright again. Well, they wanted them deeper, in the blues. So once again, I lowered those highlights, and you can see I'm doing it on that peak. So if I were to take this down, for instance, on that peak, mostly on that peak, that's going to get the worst of the highlights done. I don't want to bring it down just in the area of highlights. It's almost into the whites on the tonal range, but I'm able to then control that area of the luminance, knowing and seeing where that is. But this is where I decided to go with that. Then I'll just dock this over here so we get that out of the way. What I did was I put those in a group, and then this was the layer mask for that group. So I'm able to select a few different things here to kind of get this to overlap, but really not get those beams in there. So this then helped, but this is helping me then control all of the luminance all the way around. I'm not just stuck by having to use an ambient shot and then various ambient shots to try to get an HDR image out of this. There is way too much brightness, way too much luminance from other light sources, so I'm going to control my luminance. I'm going to control the brightness of that. I can control the brightness also down here on the floor by doing separate flash shots, keeping those separate, and then by adding in the ambient luminance as I see fit, not the ambient color. Then I can continue on editing this, add darken mode window pulls, other color corrections and whatnot, and eventually then have myself a good, well-lit, evenly controlled image with the proper luminance and brightness. But the floor, like I showed here, that's when I dropped the ISO down to 100. If you felt that this was still bright, or your client felt that this was still bright, then there's a lot of other things you could do to really lower that down. But you really don't need to usually in most cases. You could add another brightness contrast layer, try to narrow that down, but you can also do a generative fill over this as well. And that's something else. Now that you've watched this far into the video, I want to show you a bonus on something that I've done in worst cases like this. Okay, so let's zoom in here a little bit. And thank you once again also for watching this far into my video. And what I'm going to do now is do a gen fill by taking the polygon lasso tool, and I'm going to draw around this bright area, but I'm going to overlap. So I'm going to go in here just like that, close it, and then after closing it, I'll go up to edit and then generative fill. Now, I'm not going to say anything, I'm just going to go generate. Now, we're not after, in this case, a complete replacement. We're going to utilize what generative fill uses here to help improve this area of the floor. So once this is done, we're going to get then 3 options to use. And we can see here is the first option. I'll zoom a little farther out here so we can kind of see the difference. Here's then our second option and our third option. So the first option does look pretty good, and I could probably correct that there. But the trick here is then to just change the layer opacity. So if I change the layer opacity, let's say down to 51%, a lot of that is gone that's over top of the flooring. So I'll increase it a little bit more. That looks pretty good, but I'm going to take this even further. So let's say that I needed to correct this. Well, that's easy enough to do, but I'm probably not going to use that part of the image. Because what I'm going to do is right click on here, and I'm going to say new group from layers, call it whatever, and then add a layer mask. And I'll do this by going up to layer, layer mask, and then hide all. I'm not going to use all this. Then what I'm going to do is use a brush, and I'll use a very soft brush at, let's say, a 30% flow. You can see up here. And then what I'm going to do is then just tap in a little bit of this over these areas. And you can see that that is really cutting down then on this area. Now, if that doesn't seem to work very well to you, you can also, instead of having this layer as normal, you can try to also set it to darken mode so that it gives a darker appearance to those areas. So anything that's lighter is not going to be overrun on it. And you can see here then, if I take that mask and I apply all of it, then it's not going to apply everything on there that I normally would have. So you can do this, and you can try darken mode, you can try normal, but the key to this really is to use a portion of what you might get out of generative fill and then brush that in as you needed to. So once again, it's another technique that you can use to once again control over brightness and also the luminance.